It was perhaps one of the most awaited union budgets in recent times. Chidambaram's eighth, the budget has finally been delivered. It's done with, the noise has settled, and many clarifications issued. But what is it about the macro picture that really changes after Budget 2013? That's exactly what we're going to discuss with Professor Shankar Acharya, Vivek Debroy, and Pranab Sen, who are all on my panel on this special show, Macroscope, with me, Supriya Srinath. Let's kickstart this discussion, and I want to kickstart this discussion with you, Professor Acharya. The fact is that this budget was meant to shut up critics. It was supposed to deliver a message to ratings agencies and also to the Aam Aadmi. What is the big message that has been delivered with Chidambaram's eighth budget?
I think the message that the budget is trying to convey is that it is a reasonably responsible budget, which is trying to restore macroeconomic stability and trying to spur growth through growth and investment.
All right, growth, investment, a reasonably responsible budget is the word from Shankar Acharya. Pranab Sen, what do you believe was Chidambaram's message when he set out to deliver his eighth budget?
Well, I think the biggest message is to allay the apprehensions that this would be a populist budget, an election budget. I think he's put that firmly to rest. I think he has also indicated that he is serious about the GST and the direct tax code. The DTC, not in its current form, but in the form that Mr. Chidambaram had originally conceptualized it. And I think the third big message that's coming out is that he is serious about getting the fiscal deficit under control.
All right, he's serious about getting the fisc in shape, and that's perhaps the broad message, according to Pranab Sen. Professor Debroy, what do you believe is the message that the budget this year has really delivered?
I think the overall message that he wanted to deliver is that there is going to be fiscal consolidation and the deficit is going to be kept under control. So that was the overall message. The last year, the fiscal deficit was restricted at 5.2% of GDP, and this year is going to be restricted at 4.8% of GDP, particularly because the eyes of the external world, including the rating agencies, were focused on this number. I think that's the number he was trying to get across.
All right, that's the number he was trying to get across. He has managed to rein in the deficit 5.2. 4.8 many believe is an ambitious target. I'm going to touch upon that in just a bit. But talking about business in India, he started his speech by saying that foreign investment is imperative to India. We do not have a choice whether we want to welcome it or spur it away. Vivek Debroy, I'm going to stay with you because Chidambaram has tried to tell people, tried to tell investors there that I will make it easy for you to do business in India. Do you think this budget will help kickstart investments?
No, I don't think so. But at the same time, one ought not to expect the budget to do everything, because the budget is only one of the several instruments that are available to the government. So the question to ask is, what is plaguing investments in India? At one level, it is the high level of public expenditure, which is crowding out not just investments, but also private consumption expenditure. And the figures have been tossed around for a long time, which is that whether you look at savings or investments as a share of GDP, compared to the peak years, they have dropped by about 4 percentage points. Now, partly, therefore, it is the fiscal part of it. And in passing, I should mention that I have a great deal of skepticism about he being able to adhere to the 4.8% figure. The most substantive point about flagging investments is issues connected with labor, land acquisition, forest clearances and environmental clearances. The question to ask is whether the Cabinet Committee on Investments is going to ease those or not. And though the budget speech mentions that there have been 2 meetings of that, I still have some skepticism about whether these clearances will be speeded up.
All right, you're not the only one who's raised doubts about that 4.8 figure, but we're going to stay with investments for just a little while longer. Pranab Sen, the question really is that Chidambaram set out to make India an easy destination to do business. He needs to kickstart investment, not just from global, but also domestic investors. Do you think this budget will help him do that?
Well, it's clear, you know. On one hand, you have the investment allowance, which in a sense moderates the effect of a high interest rate. But on the other hand, you know, the fact of the matter is that the really big thing that the government can do is to get infrastructure investments back up. We've been through a 2-year period when it has languished. Now, unfortunately, that's not in Mr. Chidambaram's hands. I mean, he can make the money available, but if the institutions that are supposed to deliver are unable to function for one reason or the other, then, of course, we have a problem. So really, the hope now, I think, and Mr. Chidambaram said this repeatedly, rests on the Cabinet Committee on Investment to see whether or not, hard infrastructure investment can take off on the ground.
Fair enough. That's a mixed argument that you're giving there. But Professor Acharya, if I were to ask you this very important question, that do you think the budget will do enough for corporates to loosen their purse strings and start putting money on the ground? Will this actually tell them to revisit their investment plans? Will it actually tell them to invest money in India?
I have some serious reservations on that, Supriya. My big worry, and I'm not the only worried person on this, is of course our external imbalance, in particular the current account deficit on the balance of payments, which, as you know, for the full half year of the current year, it's 4.6, and most people are expecting it to be 5% of GDP or higher for the financial year 12-13. Now, against that background and the prospect that it may not change very much in the coming fiscal year very quickly, the real issue is, does the government, not the government, but has the budget done enough to significantly reduce this big worry? In other words, significantly reduce the current account deficit. And my own judgment is that it has not. And that is why I think the chances of a significant, well, you can call it a crisis, or you can call it extreme volatility in things like our exchange rate, are, in my view, quite substantial at looking for the 9, 10, 12 months ahead. So if that happens, it's hard for me to see how investment in the economy can really recover strongly.
I buy your argument about external imbalances and our inability to deal with that, but the question that one then wants to ask is, and it's an obvious follow-up, which is why I'm going to ask you this question, that do you think we were overly obsessed about the fiscal deficit, and somewhere along the line, the current account deficit or the current account gap did not get the importance that it perhaps deserved?
Well, ask yourself, well, first of all, just take the fiscal deficit. I mean, there I think the key question is, has the finance minister done enough for FY14 in terms of going down from the RE figure of 5.2% of GDP? And, going down from 5.2 to 4.8, it's true that's what he had promised, and in that sense he's kept his promise, let's not forget that. But going down by 0.4% of GDP, to my mind, in the current environment of a gaping current account deficit, is not enough. It's only 0.4%. And if you go back to the revenue deficit, again, not doubting the numbers for the moment, it's a correction of only 0.5, 0.6% of GDP, which is really the direct contribution that the budget is trying to make through improving government savings or reducing government dis-savings to bringing about balance between investment and savings in the economy, which is absolutely necessary to reduce the current account deficit.
Many concerns, of course, being raised on CAD, and you yourself is raising that concern, but Pranab Sen, if you actually do a smell test, and some economists are of the contrary opinion that if you do a smell test, the CAD may not be as alarming as is being made out to be. I mean, our forex reserves are intact, our rupee is not depreciating at this fast pace. Do you think we are perhaps making out way too much of the current account deficit?
No, I don't think too much is. I mean, any current account deficit above 3% of GDP is a source of worry. And the reason for that is that, yes, you may not see the reserves declining or the rupee going into a slump, but what you are seeing is that the aggregate liabilities of the nation to the rest of the world is going up very sharply. So you're essentially, bartering the future generations' well-being for what you're having now. So one really needs to be very, very careful. Having said that, it's a little peculiar when the finance minister and the chief economic advisor say that the current account deficit is a bigger worry than the fisc. Well, you know, the fact is that the current account deficit is the result of the fisc gone wrong. The revenue deficit is unconscionably high. And, you know, if we are talking about a revenue deficit of somewhere around 2.5%, the current account deficit would be well under 3%, and, you know, we'd all be comfortable. But the fact is that the revenue deficit is nearly 4%.
All right, so Pranab Sen believes that the revenue deficit is the big worry, and so perhaps not being made too much out of the current account deficit is a misplaced argument. But of the two evils, the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit, Professor Debroy, will you agree with me when I believe that we were perhaps too obsessed and too consumed by the fiscal deficit, and somewhere along the line the current account deficit was indeed ignored?
Well, I'd say that the current account deficit is really a symptom. It's not a disease. So if we try to address the current account deficit, we are likely to indulge in knee-jerk reactions which are liable to be counterproductive, whether it is in terms of imports of gold or something else. Partly, of course, the current account deficit widening is not just gold and prices of crude oil, but also the fact that a lot of stuff that should not be imported is now being imported, whether it's coal, whether it's iron ore, and the underlying melee, therefore, is apart from the fiscal consolidation and the fiscal deficit internally, which spills over into the current account deficit, is the melee that doing business in India has become increasingly difficult.
Dr. Acharya, the question then, obviously, after we've discussed CAD and the other challenges, is growth. I mean, 6.5% for next fiscal. There is too much of economic buoyancy that Chidambaram is, in fact, placing his bets on. He does run the risk of getting his budget mathematics horribly wrong. The question then, 6.5%, is that possible at all?
Well, I've been saying this for a while, so it's nothing new. My own view is that we'll have a pretty tough time to grow at anything higher than 6%. I would be, if you ask me a number to pick, I would say it's likely to be a little less than 6% in FY14. So if you believe that's right, and obviously we won't know as to whether I'm right or the government and the Ministry of Finance is right until some months have passed. But if you believe that it's going to be 6% or less, then it's hard to see in the following year how we get to 8%. I mean, I think that is still much too hopeful. Even if we got to 6.5, I think getting to 8% is much too hopeful. And certainly if we can't get even to 6, it looks a very long shot.
All right, while at growth, the government has really been able to take care of expenditure to a certain extent, you know, trying to get the whole diesel subsidy down and all of this. It is the revenue stream which is perhaps beginning to worry a lot of people. Planned expenditure has been cut as well, and which is why, Pranab Sen, the question that I wanted to put forward to you, the two big revenue streams that the government is looking at, besides, of course, tax receipts and all of this, is the divestment target and the spectrum proceeds. Both of these have not gone as planned this fiscal itself. What is the assurance it will go as planned the next fiscal? I mean, do you believe they run the risk of being the big duds?
Well, you're right. I mean, you know, the divestment proceedings really depend almost entirely on what's happening to the market. And the market not only is volatile, the fact of the matter is that it's also fairly thin. And with the kind of liquidity issues that are there, any divestment will have to go hand in hand with a very expansionary monetary policy, which means that the RBI has to be very much on board. And therefore, the dialogue between the Finance Ministry and the RBI is critical if for no other reason than just this one. If RBI doesn't ease up on the liquidity, you're not going to see too much happening on the divestment front. As far as spectrum is concerned, the kind of euphoria that we had last year on how much you'd get from the spectrum sale, I think that's died away. That's died away pretty quickly. I think things are much more, what should I say, realistic now, and that's what's built into the budget.
All right, so whatever the budget does is the fiscal measure. The question then is, Does it give RBI any confidence? And that's the question I'm going to stay with you, Pranav Sen, and point out to you. Do you think the budget has done enough for RBI to get the confidence and go ahead there and cut rates aggressively?
That's not obvious, actually, that it does. Because, at the end of the day, the factors which will drive the decisions of the RBI are things like what's happening on inflation. Now, headline inflation on the WPI front has eased quite substantially, and my personal take is it will continue to ease here on out. The fact of the matter is that until the RBI is very, very sure that the fiscal correction is happening, I have a feeling that the RBI governor will be very cautious.
Inflation is beginning to ease off, and which is why investors in India Inc. believes that RBI will change its mind on rates. But Professor Debroy, do you think the budget gives the RBI the elbow room to cut rates? Does this inspire confidence in Subbarao?
I think the question really confronting the RBI would be, does the RBI believe in the deficit numbers? And does the RBI, what's the RBI's take on inflation? I don't think the investment problem is primarily a monetary policy and high interest rate problem. So even if the RBI were to slash policy rates by 50 basis points, I don't think it's going to get investment up because of the other kinds of policy-related procedural problems I mentioned. If you read the economic survey, particularly Chapter 1, the thrust of economic survey seems to be that if RBI eases monetary policy, everything will be hunky-dory. I don't think it's that simple. So one part is, will the RBI take action? Well, if I were the RBI, I would be somewhat skeptical, as I said earlier, of both the deficit and the inflation part of it. Secondly, if the RBI, even if the RBI slashed the policy rates, actually I do think they're going to do that by perhaps not 50 basis points, by 25 basis points, but I don't think that's going to be enough to solve the growth problem.
So then the question really is that will the RBI look at the fiscal roadmap that has been laid out by the government? Will Subbarao buy what Chidambaram has told the world? Shankaracharya, do you believe that this is going to be possible? Does this inspire confidence in the RBI?
I would put it this way, Supriya, which is that if the current account deficit is, 4.5%, 5% of GDP or higher, I think it makes it very tough for the RBI to undertake reductions in the short-term policy interest rates like the repo.
Right. It's time to turn focus and talk about taxes. Professor Acharya, I want to begin this part of the discussion with you. GAR was the big host that was laid to rest outside of the budget. But many people thought that the retrospective amendment that was brought in, and it did create a lot of furore around the world, will perhaps be addressed in this budget. But Chidambaram has chosen not to touch upon this. Were you a little surprised?
I have no particular information or analysis at hand, and it's not that I'm following this all that closely, to have a different opinion from the one that has been reported by the finance minister's remarks recently. So if he says that first he has to come to some sort of settlement on the Vodafone case, and then think about legislative amendments, which after all were done the other way a year ago by his predecessor, I have no means of second-guessing that.
But Professor Debroy, what do you believe? I mean, the Finance Minister has chosen to be conspicuously silent on the retrospective tax amendment. Yes, I understand he's negotiating with Vodafone. I understand he is trying to, hammer a settlement there. But, he's chosen to be very, very silent on this matter, much against popular expectation.
Yes, but again, in the broader canvas, the budget is not about only addressing the issues of foreign investors, although that is important. The broad taxation issue is the budget, has the budget made the taxation structure simpler? I don't think it has. The test of the budget should be to make taxation simpler so that I don't need lawyers, I don't need chartered accountants. And in my view, there are several provisions in the budget, not just the retrospective part of it, but several things which are against the grain of simplifying it. Examples of that are taxation, service sector taxation on AC restaurants as opposed to non-AC restaurants, 2,000 square feet and stuff like that. Examples of that are the TDS on property transactions, non-agricultural. The examples of that are tinkering on customs and excise. I don't really think this has made things easier. In fact, what it suggests is an increased importance of the inspectorage. And mind you, a large amount of tax revenue, so to speak, is stuck in litigation.
You seem to want to throw the CAs and the lawyers out of jobs. Chidambaram wants to keep them in their jobs. But Pranab, saying foreign investment was spooked with this retrospective tax amendment. Contrary to popular expectation, Chidambaram hasn't touched it. Were you a little surprised and taken aback that he did not really do the apparent populist measures, as they are called, in the budget, despite the fact that elections are just a year away?
No, I was expecting it, in fact. You know, sometime around October last year, there was a dramatic shift in the way that this government actually looked at the coming elections. Earlier, the position was, you know, let's just hunker down, let's not upset anybody, and let's think of giveaways to attract votes, and hope that we'll be okay. After October, the point of view is that, look, if the economy doesn't turn around, we'll be losing a whole lot more votes than we'll ever gain by giving, you know, freebies. And so getting growth back up, I think, has become very high on the agenda. And what Mr. Chidambaram has tried to do is to try and get some of that growth back. You know, it's not whether you go to 8% or 9%. The thing is the trend upwards? Do people have hope? I think that's what they're really aiming at. And so I was expecting it. It's no surprise.
This is a final question to you, Professor Acharya. There were many reforms in the run-up to the budget. Do you believe the budget in its entirety has really put the virtuous cycle of reforms in motion, or should we expect the government to slip into an election mode?
Good question. I'm not sure I have an answer. I think this budget was not, if you like, I mean, while it didn't perhaps commit big mistakes, it didn't take forward, in my view, the policy framework to be sufficiently growth-friendly in the near future. And that's, I think, going to be it's the real problem. Whether there is further kind of populist measures announced, you know, August 15 and so on and so forth, no way of knowing. If that happens, of course, then the fiscal situation will be even worse than what we think.
All right. Professor Devroy, the last question to you. In your words, if I were to give you the opportunity to rate the union budget in 3 words, what would those 3 words be?
It is 3 words. Well, it's an impression of doing something but without really doing anything significant. The only 3-word expression that I can think of is under the circumstances. But if I use under the circumstances, I can use it to justify anything under the sun.
I appreciate how you really put this, having the impression to do a lot without having done it. That apart, we do hope at Macroscope you've been able to gauge and understand what the union budget has really done. 4 important things for the finance minister: get growth back on track, rein in the prices, bridge the twin deficits, both fiscal and current account, and of course revive investor sentiment, because that alone will put the virtuous cycle of reforms back in motion. Many more things need to be done outside of the budget, but for now, an indication has been made. It's been a pleasure being with all of you.